Welcome to another edition of Ask Andrew. Each week, I answer a film-related question submitted by you, our BMFI patrons. If you have a film-related question you'd like to see me answer, please submit it via the Ask Andrew form on the Film Studies Online section of brynmarfilm.org. On to today's question. Jerry asks, what are the origins of the Blockbuster movie? Well, this is an interesting question, one that is relevant to certainly the recent history of the American film industry. Most people, if you ask what was the first blockbuster movie, they would say Jaws, Steven Spielberg's 1975 movie. And probably this is true. This is probably the film to which the sort of trend of blockbuster films over the last 4 decades could be traced. Although it's interesting because if you look back in film history, American film history prior to that, there are other movies that could conceivably sort of claim that mantle. The Godfather, 1972, was enormously successful. And other than the fact that it didn't happen to be a summer release, has from an industrial perspective, a similar amount of attributes in common with Jaws, based on an existing property, in both cases a very well-known and popular novel, starring a mix of known and relatively unknown actors, and being a genre film that people could relate to. Some people would go even further back than The Godfather. Some people go back to Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, the 1969 movie that saved Fox from bankruptcy, or was one of the films that did that. There were a couple. Not based on a previously known property, but based on sort of previously known figures and a genre that at the time was still a viable one from a business perspective, the Western. And some people go back further still, looking at The Sound of Music from 1965, which was an enormously successful movie that far outdid the business anyone thought it could, and was based on another previously known property, which was a musical, a Broadway musical. Although Hollywood had been basing films on plays and musicals, and for that matter, books, for decades before any of these movies came along. The Sound of Music, it doesn't necessarily follow the template for the blockbuster that Jaws would, or that we see today, because it was a film that was road-showed, which meant that it played in a limited number of theaters in special engagements with higher ticket prices for quite a while before it was sort of released in a more conventional way. And that sort of release is not comparable to the way blockbusters are handled from a distribution and theatrical release point of view. So I wouldn't put too much credit in looking at that as the first blockbuster, though some film historians do. I think if we look at Jaws, as a starting point, and I think that's fair, if only because the sort of subsequent kind of films that were looking to kind of emulate the success of Jaws looked at that as the start. Although I think it's important to keep in mind that, none of these movies, even though in retrospect they were enormously successful and people can kind of figure out why, none of these movies was a guaranteed success at the time. As many people know, Jaws was rife with filming difficulties. The shark didn't work. Shooting out on actual open water was very problematic, very expensive, caused tremendous delays. And at that time, Steven Spielberg, though he'd had a couple of good films that he made and some success, was still relatively untested. But the release of the film, the summer release of the film, which really made sense because of its subject matter more than anything else, but sort of became to be connected with the younger audiences that are key to a blockbuster success, and they're having more time and disposable income to go to movies, the summer tended to become the time for them, though not the exclusive time. The holidays, end of the year, is still a time when some blockbusters choose to be released. Some of the more recent Star Wars films, for example, were released at the end of the year. But the next obvious sort of consideration for the sort of second blockbuster, the thing that kind of made them become a pattern and not a sort of one-off, is Star Wars from 1977, a movie the success of which was by no means guaranteed. In fact, a lot of people were quite surprised by its success, and some people were downright shocked. But that film added a couple of things, I should say, that Jaws didn't to the sort of blockbuster, kind of approach. One thing it added was the fact that it was a film that was appropriate for all ages. Jaws, even though it may seem tame by today's standards, at the time had some violence and had some hints of sexuality that might have made it not sort of the widely accessible, quote unquote, appropriate for the whole family movie that a lot of blockbusters sort of aspire to be. Star Wars, on the other hand, actually was barely PG. In fact, my understanding is that initial cuts of the movie would have earned or were on their way to earning a G rating, and George Lucas added back in some more explosions and some more laser blaster fights and things like that in order to make sure the movie got a PG rating, because he thought a G rating would be the kiss of death in terms of adults, even though he knew it would be just fine for the kids. The other difference with Star Wars is that it was the merchandising, right? After Star Wars, it becomes, I won't say essential because it takes a while for people to realize the value of it, but by the 80s, it becomes essential that marketing and of toys and other ancillary products is an important part of a blockbuster as well. The movie is great promotion for the sale of other items, which also help promote the movie again, because you're in the store and you see the toys. So it's kind of a cycle that benefits both. So they definitely, blockbusters, to sort of recap, definitely go back to the mid-1970s. They definitely have in common pre-existing properties, with the exception, again, Star Wars became a blockbuster, but sort of wasn't intended. Every sort of subsequent, I shouldn't say every, the majority of subsequent attempts at emulating that blockbuster model are based on pre-existing properties. You look at the sort of the next example after Star Wars, I think of the original sort of run of Superman movies that started, I believe in 1978, the first one was released. And that was clearly trying to follow the sort of blockbuster approach as well. So they start in the mid-70s. They start with a sort of new generation of filmmakers like Steven Spielberg and George Lucas. And they start, for the most part, with the use of pre-existing properties to help have a sort of built-in audience. And the content of the film tries to cast as wide a net as possible for the audience. They would develop and change in some interesting ways over the years and decades to arrive where we are now with basically Star Wars and Marvel and sort of these universes that kind of are the domain of blockbusters, or maybe it's vice versa. But that's how and when they started. And once the enormous success of a blockbuster became something that Hollywood saw, they began sort of chasing that relatively elusive goal forever. That became sort of standard operating procedure for at least part of, and I would say an increasingly part of Hollywood studios business over the course of a year. So hopefully that answers the question, and I appreciate receiving it. If you have a film-related question you'd like to send in, please visit the Film Studies Online section of brynmarfilm.org and use the Ask Andrew form. Who knows, maybe next time I'll be answering your question. Thanks.